I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, we report on news Ukraine and Russia may be holding preliminary discussions to halt attacks on each other's energy infrastructure. And we hear about two new films focused on Russian terror in the occupied territories.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong. Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 31st of October, 2 years and 256 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by Assistant Comment Editor Francis Dearnley and guests Danylo Mokryk, a war crimes reporter, and Evan Williams, a multi-award-winning producer and director who's covered the subject of war crimes. And a warning, today's episode will feature graphic descriptions of war crimes. I began with the latest news from the battlefield. A 9-storey building was hit last night in Kharkiv, destroying the entryway from the first through to the 5th floors, the State Emergency Service of Ukraine said earlier today. 2 boys, aged 12 and 15, were killed, along with another man, and at least 35 other people injured, Kharkiv Oblast Governor Oleh Symonov speaking this morning. Fires are still being extinguished in several apartments, and rescuers are searching for more victims who may still be trapped under the rubble. The 15-year-old boy who died was trapped, but died before rescuers could get him out, Mr. Symonov said. Mr. Symonov thought a Russian glide bomb was responsible for the strike. Now, a very brief aside, if I may, on what's happening here. So that glide bomb, you hear us talking about them quite a while. Glide bombs that are basically free-fall bombs that have pop-out wings and satellite navigation. Now, that glide bomb, a modified dumb bomb, basically, was probably launched from a Russian Su-34 or 35 jet. Those jets would probably have released that weapon at a range of about 50 miles. They're staying well out of the way of Ukrainian air defence. So as Kharkiv's about 20 miles from the border, the jet probably released the bomb about 30 miles inside Russia. The jet almost certainly based much further inside Russia, nowhere near the front lines. Now, Ukraine's air defence can't currently reach far enough to hit that airfield or the jet as it's about to release the glide bomb. Can't reach that far in any great numbers. Some Ukrainian long-range drones can, and we've seen such strikes on airfields and energy infrastructure deep inside Russia, but the standard Ukrainian air defence that's widely used can't. So, without policy permissions from the US and others to use Western-donated military equipment inside Russia, what's the answer to these kind of strikes? Does Ukraine just have to suck it up? Now, there isn't really an answer for anyone sticking to the escalation management argument, or rather there is an answer or an explanation that they could give, in which case I would invite them to talk to the parents of the 2 boys killed last night through the escalation management rationale, or maybe they could go and shout through the rubble to the 15-year-old boy's body and explain to him why he had to die in order not to provoke Vladimir Putin. But anyway, I digress. A good descriptor of this, of what glide bombs are and what Ukraine can and cannot do about it, was contained in a report by the RAND Corporation. Have a look at that. It was from June this year. It's called How Ukraine Can Defeat Russian Glide Bombs. We'll put a link to that in the episode notes for today. Anyway, on last night's strike, President Zelensky said partners see what happens every day. In these circumstances, every delayed decision on their part means dozens or even hundreds more Russian bombs used against Ukraine. Their decisions are the lives of our people. That is why we must stop Russia together and do so with all possible force. All possible force being the important bit there. Now, sticking in Kharkiv, and we should have said earlier in the week, on Monday, the city's iconic Dezhprom building, that's the state industry building, was damaged by Russian shelling. The historic landmark 13-storey building under enhanced UNESCO protection since 2022 was hit by another suspected glide bomb on Monday. Nobody thought to have been killed. We do understand a little of the importance of the building, and I've been trying to find the right time and the right guest, to be honest, to do justice to the significance of this attack and Russia's continued attempts to erase Ukrainian cultural identity. And we hope to be able to do something on this next week in a deeper way than just saying, a building was hit. It's more than that. But for now, I'll just quote Victoria Gravina, PhD researcher on Kharkiv at the University of St Andrews. She comes from Kharkiv. She spoke to the Kyiv Independent earlier this week and said, for people from Kharkiv, Dezhprom is like our Statue of Liberty or Eiffel Tower or Buckingham Palace. So we do recognise the significance of that. We're just trying to wait for a time and space and guests to do it justice. Otherwise, very little move on the front in the last day. There have been very small Russian tactical gains in the Donbass, but none of them adding up to any greater threat to cross as there has been for the last few weeks. And last night, Russia launched at least 50 drones. Ukrainian air defences shot down 17 across various regions, the Air Force said this morning. 2 X-59 and 69 variant missiles were also downed. 9 people killed across the country, including those I mentioned earlier. 9 killed across the country in Sumy, Kharkiv, Donetsk and Kherson oblasts. There were strikes elsewhere, including 10 missiles that were fired into Odessa, but no reports of casualties. Now, we've been giving prominence to the whole North Korean thing of late because it is very important. We do need to keep an eye on it. Looks like we've had the first confirmation that North Korean troops are not just in Russia, but also now in Ukraine. So CNN, citing 2 unspecified Western intelligence officials, reported yesterday that North Korean troops are in an unspecified area of occupied Ukraine. Now, connected and speaking at the UN yesterday, Robert Wood, the Deputy US Ambassador to the UN, said should the DPRK, that's the formal title, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, formal title for North Korea, should DPRK enter Ukraine in support of Russia, they will surely return in body bags. I would advise Chairman Kim to think twice about engaging in such reckless, endangered behaviour. Pretty strong words. Now, his remarks came after North Korea's UN envoy Kim Song accused the United States, South Korea and others of being culprits, in his words, culprits that disturb peace and inflict harm on world security. Now, the Yonhap news agency in South Korea reporting that, thanks to the real Bob, basically, for giving me a steer on how to interpret Yonhap's reporting. They're an agency I've not done much with before, not worked with before, not read an awful lot about. So I didn't know, as I said yesterday, wasn't sure through which lens I was receiving their information. But thank you for giving me a steer on that. Now, Mr. Wood's words, Robert Wood, the Deputy US Ambassador to the UN, his words may have been stronger than usual, given that yesterday was also the day North Korea chose to test its latest intercontinental ballistic missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. Apparently this latest test, it flew for over an hour, about 1,000 kilometres into the Pacific, but importantly at a steeper angle than it would normally be fired in an operational use. So analysts have said that if it was fired in a sort of flatter, more normal ICBM angle or trajectory, it would be able to hit the continental United States. Now, a test isn't capability. It's just a test. But the US will be extremely concerned by that, especially as another report by CNN today said North Korea is very likely to ask Moscow for advanced technology related to nuclear weapons in exchange for deploying their troops to Ukraine. They're reporting South Korea's Defense Minister Kim Yong-hyun speaking in the Pentagon yesterday. So we were opining what North Korea might be getting in return for sending troops to Ukraine. And we thought missile technology, and in particular nuclear missile technology, was going to be high on the wish list. And CNN reporting or quoting South Korea's defense minister as saying that looks likely to be the case. One last one for me. I note today Australia is to invest about 18 billion Australian dollars, 12 billion US dollars, to make advanced guided missile systems in the country, in Australia, for the first time, part of a continuing overhaul of Australia's defence strategy. So there's an article in today's Financial Times that says Pat Conroy, who's Australia's defence industry minister, he said competition between the US and China was the sharpest, his words, in the Indo-Pacific area. Mr. Conroy wasn't responding directly to that news about the North Korean ICBM test, but it's all part of the same mix. Canberra has shifted its military posture to what it's called the missile age, in its latest strategy, increasing defence spending by 50 billion Australian dollars. That's just over 30 or about 33 billion US dollars. That's spread over 10 years. Now, this new facility is going to be a joint Australian facility with Lockheed Martin, the US arms manufacturer, to produce guided multiple launch rocket system weapons and ammunition from 2029. I think just the missiles, actually, not the launchers. But it's going to be the first such facility outside the US, and they say it's going to produce 4,000, or in fact Mr. Conroy says it's going to produce 4,000 missiles a year, a quarter of the current global production. Now, I know this is Ukraine, the latest, but these are all linked, and I think it's important that we bring it to your attention. Now, moving away, I know I've sort of strayed a little bit into the political diplomatic industry sphere there, but for more of a deep dive on those stories, Francis, what have you been looking at?
Thanks, Dom. I want to start with a remarkable story in the Financial Times that preliminary discussions may be underway between Ukraine and Russia to halt attacks on each other's energy infrastructure. So, sources familiar with the talks report that Kyiv is hoping to rekindle Qatar-mediated negotiations that were cut short in August when Ukraine launched an incursion into Kursk. A diplomat briefed on these discussions noted that talks now focus specifically on safeguarding energy facilities, signalling what many would call quite a major de-escalation prior to the onset of winter. So, where do we stand on this in terms of the context? Well, President Zelensky suggested some time ago that an agreement to protect energy sites could pave the way for broader peace talks. That's something that both Moscow and Kyiv might want to consider as we look at the presidential election, which we'll know the result of in just under a week. Moscow, they are keen to stress in the piece, has yet to agree to this, but there are reports of an understanding brokered by intelligence agencies that has seen a reduction in some attacks on energy infrastructure in recent weeks. Now, as you'll know from our extensive reporting on the energy issue, the stakes are extremely high for Ukraine, which is extremely dependent on European imports and nuclear facilities after the strikes decimated nearly half of its energy generation capacity. Now, Putin is yet to formalise any agreement with Ukraine, and indeed is unlikely to do so, the sources speculate, whilst Ukrainian troops are in Kursk. But it is interesting that this is even being contemplated, if it is, as the reports suggest. Many, though, would, I must say I would put myself in this camp, would argue that it's not in Moscow's strategic interests to cease these strikes. It's certainly not something they're concerned about morally, and so it may well just be a false end, a means of keeping a conversation channel open that doesn't come to many intense fruitions. But again, I'd love to be wrong. Perhaps they would think it provides a means of bringing certain partners to their side in future negotiations, if they can say, look, we've done this as a matter of good faith, we don't want to see Ukrainian civilians killed. I mean, it's nonsense, of course, given the numerous efforts of war crimes that they've perpetrated over the last 3 years. But nonetheless, it's possible that there is a political motivation behind this, or would be one. But nonetheless, I'm sceptical, to be honest with you. But if we look at the Ukrainian perspective, the energy benefits would be manifold. Winter in Ukraine is extremely tough, suffice to say, and there are extreme concerns about what it would mean for millions of people to be out of energy. Also, this is a delicate moment, to put it mildly, from the Ukrainians' perspective. That row that you spoke about yesterday, Dom, between Washington and Kyiv over the leaked requests for Tomahawk missiles going to Kyiv just speaks, I think, to how distressed Zelensky is and must be feeling at the moment, vocalising it as the way that he did. They clearly feel let down, and the levels of support have not been reached as was promised some time ago in terms of just the deliveries, let alone some of the weapons permissions and otherwise. And that's before you even bring in the prospect of Trump being re-elected to the White House. Now, it continues to be Europe which will play the vital role long term, of course, even if Harris were to win. And it is interesting in another development that the former Estonian Prime Minister, incoming EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas, has now stated that one of her top priorities will be to strengthen European security. Not necessarily surprising in and of itself, but if you read her remarks, they are quite telling. She says, European security is deeply personal to me as a native of a country that has long told others that Russia's imperialistic dream never died. Actors such as Russia, Iran, North Korea and partly China aim at weaponizing interdependencies and exploiting the openness of our societies against us. For this, we must be prepared. Now, it's very interesting to see China's name mentioned there at a time when France and Germany and other countries in Europe are still trying to maintain or even expand their relationship economically with China. I also think it's interesting seeing those four names thrown together. There was a time when those countries would, I think that the bonds, the connections, the lines being drawn between them would have been seen as not confirmed enough to be spoken about publicly by world figures. That has now changed fundamentally. They are being seen as more of a bloc, more of an entity. And that does speak to this Cold War too, that some people are articulating this current war and wider context as. Now, playing into that, of course, would be what's going on in the Baltics. And indeed, another development by nearby Finland is that the country's begun seizing Russian assets within its borders. So the Finnish National Enforcement Authority recently confiscated several properties owned by the Russian state, including the Russian Centre of Science and Culture in Helsinki. Tensions with Russia are currently extremely high, as we've been reporting on, and I think we can expect there to be several more developments out of Finland over the coming weeks. But I did just want to mention that one there. Again, more signs of things going further, inching forward on the economic front. Another economic story from the other side of the border, as it were, is we've been looking at the role of Western tech firms recently operating within Russia, and I'll be returning to that in my final thought. But it's worth mentioning that there is another lawsuit ongoing in Moscow at the moment that claims Google has unpaid fines of 2 undecillion rubles. Yes, I had to look undecillion up as well. It's a staggering number. That's 33 zeros after the figure. It's almost as high as Dom's unpaid bar tab. Now, the fine stems from Google's refusal to reinstate YouTube accounts of pro-Kremlin outlets, including Russia Today and many others. They were blocked, of course, for violating US sanctions. Obviously, this is a symbolic move by the Kremlin, but it speaks volumes, I think, as to the approach that Moscow is adopting towards those companies, and also more broadly some of the other themes that I'm going to return to later on. But let's end this section warming up for the next one, which is, of course, the subject of the occupied Ukrainian territories and the experience being endured there by civilians. There have been some recent reports from Ukraine's National Resistance Centre revealing just the reality faced by residents that we're going to get into again today. We've obviously already reported on the re-education camps, the confiscations of property. Another interesting snippet in it that we haven't necessarily talked about before is the seizure of satellite equipment. They're very concerned about communication getting out from the occupied territory and indeed information going in. Now, there is much evidence too, of course, of Russian forces tightening control, further suppression of cultural identity, some 100 detention sites now, I think, imposing that cultural erasure. But I think it's more appropriate really for us to get into more granular detail with our guests on this, but I wanted to mention it here that there are continual reports that lay some of the rumours to rest, that we do have some information that's coming out of them, but it's still very, very hard to come by. But back to you, Dom.
Thanks, Francis. Now, for the rest of this episode, we're going to dedicate it to the subject of war crimes in the light of 2 new films released on the subject. So we're very pleased to be joined by Danylo Mokryk, War Crimes Investigations Unit reporter at the Kyiv Independent, about his latest investigative documentary, Shadows Across the River, that examines the use of terror against Ukrainian citizens in the occupied territories. And we're also very pleased to have with us Evan Williams, multi-award-winning producer-director, specialising in international films for Channel 4, PBS Frontline and others. The lead producer on the new film On the Crane's Call, and went on all the filming trips to Ukraine with director Laura Warner. Now, that film is about war crimes investigator who teams up with a Ukrainian woman so they can record the crimes committed in order to bring Russian military personnel to trial. Guys, very pleased and honoured to have you with us. Francis is going to take the lead on this section, but I'd just like to start off, if I may, by asking both of you what new information you discovered through working on these films. So, Danylo, if I could go to you first, please, and then to Evan, and then Francis will take over.
Well, thanks for having me, first of all, and thanks for your interest to our investigation. I'll start by saying that it's available on YouTube and anyone can find it on my page in a pinned tweet. When we first had this idea of investigating what's happening under Russian occupation, specifically on the so-called left bank of the Kherson region, we thought that it was hardly possible because you cannot get there. And even when you try to talk to people who left the occupation, they are often afraid to talk to journalists and even to law enforcement because they have relatives there still in the occupied territory. They still have family there, or they may have friends there, and they are often afraid of retaliation if Russians know that they talk to someone. So it's really hard to even get people to testify, to get any information. And we had to contact like dozens and dozens of people. And finally, the picture that we have is that of a systematic occupation terror, which means abductions or kidnappings of people without any formal charge, which means disappearance of people. So people are taken by Russian military or by Russian police, and they are never heard of again. And of course, torture to death. So we know of several instances in the Kherson region, and we talk about them in the documentary, when people were just tortured to death. And in the film, we decided to focus on just one town with a particular torture chamber established by Russian commandant's office. But then again, we know that such torture chambers and such practice exists all over the occupied part of the Kherson region. And we know that hundreds of people went through torture chambers and were victims of war crimes. But it's very hard to establish the exact number or even an estimate because, once again, we do not have access there. And there's a lot of witnesses that we just cannot get to and talk to. So basically, that's the idea that we have of what's happening there. And we know that there are several reasons for abductions and torture. First of all, the first and the most obvious reason looks like an attempt to crush any potential resistance. So they are deliberately targeting ex-Ukrainian servicemen and even gun owners. So if there's a hunter there, for example, with a registered weapon, they will come to him to confiscate the weapon and to interrogate him too. The second reason is extortion. They often abduct and torture people who have even small businesses, and they force them to give up their cars and their money and sometimes their houses. The third reason is punitive. So any expression of loyalty to Ukraine, of Ukrainian patriotism, is also subject to punishment, to abduction, to torture. And I guess the fourth overall reason for this practice of terror is just to keep the local population subjugated so that they know that they are under control and there is no real hope for them to shed the occupation away. And I really like to stress that when we are talking about those crimes, we are not talking about only 2022. It is still happening right now. One of the cases that we are examining in our documentary is about a man abducted and tortured to death in November 2023. And we know that the practice continues this year too. I want to stress that because the Russian propaganda would try to make you believe that life under occupation has now stabilized and people are more or less content, and that is simply not true. It is important to understand too, because when we are talking about any possible peace plans that would include freezing the conflict and effectively leaving Ukrainian territories under Russian control, that would mean condemning the people there to torture and to terror. If someone has this idea that if you are not satisfied with what is happening under Russian occupation, you can just leave, this is simply not true. People are very often trapped there, and being pro-Ukrainian, being a Ukrainian patriot is not a reason to get you deported or expelled from the occupied territory. On the contrary, and it's a paradox really, if they know that someone is pro-Ukrainian, they will not let this person leave. And so people are just simply trapped and awaiting their fate under this regime of terror. So this would be broadly the description of what I have to say.
Thank you for that, Danylo. I'll definitely have some questions for you in a moment. But Evan Williams, if you could talk about your film.
Hi, everybody. I just want to first of all, acknowledge the great work our colleagues in Ukraine, Danylo and others are doing it under extremely difficult circumstances. Obviously, we all work together out there and they do a fantastic job, as do the investigators. Our project, just to give you a rough idea, we found out that the Clooney Foundation for Justice had conducted or started an investigation into Russian war crimes, specifically in Ukraine, very early on after this full-scale invasion. We got access to their lead investigator, Anya Neistad, who is a human rights investigating veteran who'd firmly been in Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and others, originally from Russia herself, but had lived many, many years investigating, in some cases, the same commanders and the same generals now involved in the Ukraine offensive. She'd been working in Syria, in Jordan, in Chechnya, inside Russia itself, so she came with a great deal of knowledge. She very quickly teamed up with a local Ukrainian woman, Solomia Stasev, who started off as a very junior person in the project, but very quickly became extremely good at delving in on the ground at the detail. And what they were trying to do in a very unique way was to use the criminal justice system in countries in Europe outside Ukraine to prosecute war crimes as criminal offences under a thing called universal jurisdiction, which basically was formed after World War II. And it postulates the idea that some crimes are so egregious that they can be tried under criminal processes in any country. And so this was a way that Anya thought that the criminal justice system could be used to put pressure on Russian commanders and officers that their actions would be held accountable not in 10 or 20 or 30 years through the normal international processes, but could actually be facing criminal justice very quickly. And so she called this lawfare and went out there, and we followed her from day one to try and look at some of these alleged war crimes that had occurred. She went out with an open mind, but very quickly it became apparent there were three main areas. And this reaffirms very much what Danylo is talking about there. We went out to areas, first of all, that had been formerly occupied very soon after remember there was the big push by the Ukrainians in the east, south of Kharkiv, when they retook a big chunk of territory from the Russians. We went straight out there, literally within about 2 weeks of the Russians falling back into one or two locations very close to the Russian front lines. And we found very, very similar things to what Danylo is talking about. So the systematic use of detention, of torture, execution, mainly focused on individuals that they considered could have either been pro-Ukrainian through their cultural expressions or their former histories. They might have been formerly fighting in the Donbass from 2014. They might have been a police officer. They might have just been, in some cases, using a telephone in what was considered to be a suspicious way. I mean, all sorts of things were happening. And in one case, I remember very, very clearly, we were taken by a man who had been arrested in the last week of Russian occupation to the police station that the Russians occupied and into the basement where he was held for just over a week, and going deeper into the police station, into the torture room, the torture center that had been used, where they connected electricity to parts of his body and were torturing him over many, many days. Fortunately for him, the Russians withdrew only a week or so after his detention, and he was freed. But he was basically detained because he'd gone there to stay with his mother just before the invasion, and he was trying to call his wife, and he used to go to a hilltop to try and get signal, and somebody thought that this was suspicious, that he might have been radioing in Russian positions or something, which he denied. But it just shows you the sort of level of control that was going on. And of course, this was, we followed also cases of a Ukrainian writer, a man called Vladimir Vakolenko, who was a very ardent Ukrainian nationalist who wrote about it and wrote an actual diary chronicling life under occupation. He was detained because it seems he was a Ukrainian nationalist, and he was executed. And we found out many more details in the course of the film. Two other broad areas that the team were looking at then. Further south, we went outside Odessa, and they investigated what they call an indiscriminate use of major war weapons. These were huge missiles that had been fired by aircraft and basically had hit not only an apartment building, but also a recreation centre. And these bombs and missiles are being used completely indiscriminately in civilian areas. That in itself is potentially a war crime. And so we looked at those, we looked at torture, and of course we looked also at sexual violence and rape under the authority of commanding officers. And in some cases they were drunk, in some cases they weren't. So these were the 3 or 4 main areas that we looked at in the film as they conducted their investigation. And as I say, they've submitted these first initial 3 cases of torture, execution, detention, rape to German federal prosecutors. They now go through the process of investigating themselves, and they could well be, what their aim is, to get sealed red notices issued by governments like in Germany, but many, many others as well. And that should any of these officers try and travel from Russia, they would be arrested and taken to the jurisdiction for criminal prosecution. And there's many things we can talk about around that, but that's effectively the framework. And I'd say the success in getting information so quickly surprised them as well. So there's a lot out there that is about to come to fruition, I think.
Well, thank you very much for that, Evan. And I'll come back to you to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But I just want to go back to Danylo, if I may, first of all. Danylo, this is a difficult question, but I wonder, first of all, when you were talking about the perpetrators of these terror actions, exactly who are they? And that might sound like a simplistic question, but I mean in a sort of more granular sense, like where are they from? What rank are they? What's their mentality towards Ukrainians, etc.? And I'm also interested whether you get any sense of a remorse or indeed the reverse, because there have been many reports of this being activity that's actually been encouraged by not only their fellow soldiers, but indeed people back home as well. And we've talked about that in the past. So just some of those broad questions, Danylo, interested in your perspective.
Well, we have identified the actual perpetrators of the torture. They were Russian policemen who came to the Kherson region after the occupation. So they previously served in different regions of Russia. And but there are also some collaborators. One of the policemen that we identified was a former Ukrainian policeman who joined Russians when the occupation started in 2022. First in the Zaporizhia region, and then he moved to the Kherson region and actively participated in terror in general and in torture in particular. So their attitude seems to be that, as people recounted, is that, well, either you say that you are Russian and you pledge your loyalty to Russia, or you are less than a human being and you deserve to be punished. We also know that there are often representatives of the FSB. Sometimes, initially, the terror was conducted by the Russian military too. And the difficulty in identifying them is that there's a lot of rotations happening, especially in 2022. It seems to be a bit easier to identify them since 2023 because they somehow settle down more or less, and then they spend more time in one place. That is true, again, particularly about the police officers feel any kind of remorse. The torture police officers conducted in Honostaivka was so widespread and was so bad that at one point, even the Russian judiciary system started persecuting him, not for torture or crimes against humanity, but for abuse of office. But there is a very simple way for any of them to avoid any criminal responsibility. So you just have to enlist in the army. And there is really no hope for Russian justice. So that's more or less the situation with those perpetrators.
Thank you. That's extremely interesting. And just one more question connected to the horrors that you've been describing, Danylo. Of course, children is another theme of the war crimes that are being perpetrated in the occupied territories. Thousands of children being taken. Now, the figure that's quite often cited is 19,000. Recently, the Ukrainian ombudsman said that it was now over 20,000, which isn't a surprise given that the figure of kidnapped children hasn't been updated properly for many, many months now, perhaps even a year. I just wondered whether you could talk a little bit about the issue of children and what you know at the Kyiv Independent.
Well, we had an investigation about it last year, and I don't think that much has changed. And I guess we have talked about it previously. We tend to see this as just another attempt to erase the Ukrainian identity, and it falls very specifically under the definition of genocide in the UN Convention. I mean, there are 5 acts of genocide, and one of them is forcibly deporting children from one group to another group. So I would say that it really underscores the genocidal intent behind Russian invasion of Ukraine, because you can explain war crimes on the front line, okay, by some logic of military necessity. You can even try to explain terror against civilians by the need to control and crush any possible resistance. But when it comes to deporting children, there is no strategic goal and there is no military tactic behind that other than this will to erase the Ukrainian identity in them. So it's just part of the bigger picture. And I personally would not try to analyze that. This is just one of the puzzles that explains the genocidal intent. I'm not sure that there are a lot of developments in child abductions and the Ukrainian attempts to bring the children back. It's a very hard process and it's very hard to follow it now, because when we are talking about war crimes, they mainly happen on the territory that is controlled by Russia and where you have no access to.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Now, Evan, coming back to you, you were talking about the lawfare and the methods that are being adopted to try and, in a sense, bring some justice ahead before the war ends. And I wonder, what are the best case scenarios? You talked about the suit that's being filed, but what are the best case scenarios that we could see as a result of that? I mean, are the two ladies optimistic about the prospects of there being some verdicts actually reached that would mean that there has been the law stamped, as it were, that crimes have been committed and that justice should be done?
Yeah, I mean, to give it a little further context, the focus that emerged through their work were, I mean, let's remember, there's something like, and Danylo can confirm this at the moment, there's something like 130,000 alleged war crimes being investigated by the Ukrainian authorities as we speak, and that number's growing every day. So the Ukrainians are taking care of, if you like, the soldiers and middle-ranking or lower-ranking officers. They can go after them, and they're doing a very good job in getting that underway. The ICC, etc., as we now know through the children case you just mentioned, have got charges out against President Putin in certain cases. But what became apparent was that the middle-ranking officers, senior officers, district commanders, that sort of thing, people actually in charge of the units on the ground, were in a way slipping between those two criminal justice sort of systems. So that's what they're focused on. So they're going for these guys that are actually responsible for the men, and they're going all the way up as far as they can to senior commanders within the Kremlin's military structure. Now, what they hope is that these red notices get what they call arrest warrants get issued. And now it all sounds to us, we had the same sort of skeptical question. If a Russian officer has been involved in the invasion in Ukraine, how likely is it that he's going to leave Russia? But let's remember that these guys are in positions of power and authority, and they have means, and a lot of them do actually like to either have their travel, they like to travel to previously to Europe, to Dubai. There's financial reasons why they do that as well. And it's very, very possible that this layer of commander could well be traveling quite soon. And that's when these arrests could actually take place. They would then be taken to these jurisdictions. Then the criminal justice procedure would then be ongoing. Now, how optimistic are they? Well, look, they're very realistic about the possibilities of this happening. But let's start with one point. First of all, they think it's better to try and do something than to do nothing in this situation. Second of all, they are hoping that as soon as there is at least one arrest, that it will get out very quickly to the rest of the Russian military structure and officers and soldiers that this is a new system in place that they may well face themselves. Hopefully, Anya and Solomir are aiming or hoping that this would have an impact on these officers and their decisions going forward, and it may curb future commitments of war crimes. Let's say it may be an Air Force person or somebody. Do they actually press the button if they know that they could be in a German court within 5 years? The third thing to say about this is that things do change, and it's very hard for us to imagine that things would change in Russia today. But if you look back at some of the dictators in recent times, things have changed. And I'm thinking there of some African situations. It's not completely inconceivable that even if the power structure does not collapse completely in Russia, that, let's say, certain members of the military might well get thrown under a bus by surviving members of a new structure in Russia. Anything can happen. And Anya's point is that at least if we've got the case on file, at least if it's being picked up by prosecutors in France, in Germany, in Argentina, in Australia, many other countries, some Eastern European countries are picking up on this as well, that there is the possibility that these people will be held accountable in quite short time. So that's the best case scenario. We're looking at probably dozens, possibly more, of middle-ranking and senior commanders and generals who are involved in alleged war crimes against civilians across Ukraine at the moment in various ways, as I said. And you mentioned earlier on the firing of these missiles into civilian areas. I saw today a story about the Russians allegedly using drones to specifically target civilians in Kherson. That in itself ostensibly would be a war crime, as opposed to using it in a military context. So there's more and more happening, and they hope that there will be quite a large number of these guys potentially eventually facing criminal justice.
Well, Danylo, Evan, thank you so much for those words. We'll come back to you shortly for final thoughts, but time's marching on, so let's move towards the end now. I'll start with pointing people towards, if they so wish, an article in today's Financial Times titled "The New Face of European Illiberalism." It's a study, basically, of Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico. It says Mr. Fico's return to power and those that he sought to blame after the attempted assassination, the attempt on his life in May earlier this year, in the FT's word, show how the political map of Central Europe is being... Now, they suggest the emergence of a new illiberal bloc and highlight Robert Fico's close links to Viktor Orban in Hungary, but also say, and here's a quote, Fico is not yet fully in the Hungarians' camp on Ukraine. He's made several pro-Kremlin gestures and has criticised Western sanctions against Russia, but he did not join Orban in threatening to veto a €50 billion EU aid package for Ukraine. He campaigned against military support to Kyiv, but has allowed private Slovak companies to send more than €100 million of weapons to Ukraine since 2023. However, they also say earlier this month he promised, he said, as long as he was in power, he would stop Ukraine joining NATO. So, it does look at the man and the current state of Slovak politics. Well worth a read. That's in today's FT. But Francis, can I come to you, please, for your final thoughts?
Thanks, Dom. And I want to thank our guests for their time today and highly recommend those documentaries. And to also thank you listening at home for taking the time to hear that distressing content. You didn't have to, but you chose to. And, well, it's important, isn't it? But for my final thought, I do want to return to a different subject, and that is this continuing debate over Western companies, especially those involved in the sharing of information, withdrawing their services or making accommodations to autocratic regimes. An interesting email has come in from a listener who wishes to remain anonymous, and they offer an insider's perspective from somebody who's worked in that world over recent decades. They write, any company that operates in a country must obey the laws and regulations. If you don't, then you face fines, penalties, or even criminal prosecution. Think the Huawei executives in Canada, the Google executives in Brazil. If you don't have an office, then a country may impose blocks on your service, like happened with YouTube in Turkey and China a while back, Twitter recently in Brazil. And staff are liable to arrest. Companies are aware of this. They circulate travel advisories to employees to avoid it. It's irrelevant if you disagree with an authoritarian regime. The laws still exist and are enforced. So implying that Apple isn't standing up for values is nonsensical. If they've been told to remove an app, they must remove it or face the penalties or face being blocked and staff being risked inside the country. I'll share a couple of semi-related anecdotes. I was responsible for the rollout of one major search engine in Russia in the late 2000s. Part of the task was to meet with telecoms firms to buy international circuits and also to interconnect locally, as well as locate suitable data centres. Even at those more free times, they absolutely did send FSB agents to be present at certain meetings. I don't speak Russian, but my conversation with the staff was along the lines of what power do you have, what generators and backup systems, etc., etc. Standard stuff for this sort of deployment. There followed a short chat in Russian between staff and this agent, and the staff simply replied, "Why do you need this information? No, we can't give it to you." It seemed innocuous to me, the information I was asking for, but they were so serious. Now that we see sabotage in the EU, perhaps they wanted to guard their own infrastructure even back then. Another story regarding a major search engine in China, also from the late 2000s. We had offices, equipment, network, and a Chinese version of the platform live. But the entire operation was ring-fenced. For example, when I flew into the country, despite having high-level access to all of our systems and information globally, my access was limited to just China. Why? Well, we learnt later a famous hack took place, and I read the internal report about it. The Chinese government wanted to have personal, identifiable information about activists globally. The company resisted the legal attempts to access that information, and eventually it was hacked in the most highly sophisticated style I have ever seen. Shortly after the search engine shut in China, it got blocked as well, allowing the Chinese firms to take up the place it had held, and presumably with the kind of information sharing they had desired from big tech. In summary, these aren't just Silicon Valley companies operating from afar, producing the internet. It involves real people, real money, potentially targets of other hostile states. One must be careful when you defy such a state, even if you're just trying to bring cats on skateboarding videos to viewers or, more importantly, a radio streaming site. So I want to thank that listener for that insight, which does expose the complexities of this issue. One might argue that a more sensible approach from Western countries in the 90s onwards, backed by government, would have been to be unequivocal that tech firms would not compromise the values of the countries that produce them, re suppressing information, and therefore that if Russia, China wanted the advantages of the technology, they had to acquiesce, instead of the policy adopted whereby some firms compromised those values for profit and arguably gave those regimes advantages of Western tech with fewer disadvantages. Or if one were to be more generous, tried to adopt a more halfway house approach with some accommodations, but not comprehensive, because they felt that you're never going to get comprehensive, so it's better to have half of it and hope that you might help things a bit. But the firmer stance would have required a far more robust approach to safeguarding Western technology. And that still doesn't mean dictatorships wouldn't have tried to develop their own versions. Perhaps it wouldn't have happened at the same pace that they've been able to keep up with. So this is a genuine conundrum. I'm not trying to offer a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter answer. But nonetheless, it's interesting. And I think few people could argue that the approach that was adopted has been a successful one, because we are where we are today with these companies, in some cases completely booted out, in other cases operating under severe restrictions. And one has to wonder what the ramifications are that broadly for global security. But I will end on that, but welcome to listeners to continue to write in on this subject.
Thanks, Francis. It's an interesting perspective. Yeah, Apple, I guess that they're in a difficult position, but you got to wonder, what's the bigger game here? Not that it's a game at all. Whether or not they should take the huge stake of removing themselves from the Russian market. But, I know you say standing up for values is nonsensical, but what else have we got? If it's just down to money, well, I don't think that's necessarily a particularly good place to end up, because what do you anchor yourself to? But anyway, that's enough for me. Danylo, Evan, thank you so much for joining us today. Please leave us with your final thoughts. And if I may prompt you, if I could direct your final thoughts, you don't have to, but if you so wish, may I ask what shocked you as hardened documentary makers about the issues you discovered through your work?
At this point, nothing really shocks me anymore. I mean, one of my first investigations in 2022 and then again in 2023 was about the deliberate killings of the Ukrainian children by Russian military with firearms. So after that, you reach a point where you do not get to be shocked anymore. What I wanted to say is my final thought is that if you maybe, or if someone maybe thinks that war crimes, Russian war crimes against civilians have stopped, that is not true. They keep on torturing and killing on the occupied territory. And that is something I'd like people to keep in mind every time they bring up the freezing of the conflict or some kind of territory bargain with Russia. I'd just like people to keep in mind what that would mean to the people there. That's maybe the most important thing.
Thank you. And Evan?
I totally agree with Danylo on that front. I would say it sounds obvious, but in some ways, when you're up close to this, the systematic nature of the violence against civilians, I mean, the torture on the ground, the detention, the sexual violence, the rape, the use of these massive missiles, everything consistently on a daily basis thrown at Ukraine in a very organized and systematic nature. Usually these sort of war crimes, you can find they might blame a sort of a rogue unit or a rogue general, or it might be a special circumstance. But the systematic and enduring nature of the way in which Russia is fighting this war, I think, to me, was one of the most shocking things, let alone the personal testimonies of the survivors. I'd like to say one thing, and it reinforces what Danylo said. I think also what I came back with after many trips to Ukraine, and I think it's something we really have to remember as we all look at, do we continue the support, etc., is the amazing resilience and the pride and the nationalism of the Ukrainian people. You know, it's very easy for us to swallow a propaganda line that they're all divided and they're not going to survive and it's all going to, you know, that's not the case. The resilience and the honour of the people is quite astounding, and I think it's something we should keep in mind. One thing, if you could just allow me, anybody who wants to see our documentary is on Channel 4 on Sunday, this Sunday night at 11:30 p.m, but can be seen on All 4 straight after that for those who can't stay up that late. So we'd very much like you to follow up both on our documentary and also Danylo's.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.